It was a moonless night in the Pacific, the kind of darkness that swallowed even the stars. Out on the restless black water, 12 American patrol boats, each no larger than a suburban bus, each armed with little more than torpedoes and guts, waited in silence. They were the smallest warships in the U.S. Navy, built of wood and painted in shadow. Against them came a Japanese convoy of destroyers and transports, steel giants bristling with guns, carrying soldiers, fuel, and supplies vital to Japan's war in the Solomon Islands. What happened next would shock the Imperial Navy and rewrite the rules of night warfare. Because that night, in a stretch of ocean the Japanese believed they owned, 12 PT boats attacked and sank an entire convoy in a storm of fire, thunder, and chaos. These were the mosquito boats, fragile, fast, and fearless. Their crews were young men who knew that one shell hit could vaporize them instantly. Yet they went out anyway, threading through enemy searchlights and tracer fire like ghosts. They fought not for fame or glory, but because someone had to stop the convoys that fed Japan's war machine. What they did on that night, with nothing but wooden hulls and torpedoes, barely longer than the boats themselves, would humiliate Japanese. Admirals who believed such vessels were nothing more than toys, if you want to explore the forgotten, brutal ingenuity of naval warfare, where courage mattered more than armor, and silence was deadlier than guns. Then join us. Like, share, and subscribe so we can keep resurrecting the hidden moments of World War II. Moments when the tide turned not because of strategy, but because of sheer audacity. The night smelled of salt, oil, and fear. Somewhere in the Solomon Islands, a dozen patrol torpedo boats floated on the edge of black water, their engines idling low, the sound almost drowned by the hum of crickets and the slow roll of the tide. The men aboard them were young, some barely out of high school, but their eyes were already old. The war aged people differently here. It wasn't years that wore them down, it was the waiting, the endless, unbearable silence before a mission began. The PT boats were wooden, fast, light, and fragile. They were never meant to fight in open water against destroyers that outweighed them by thousands of tons. Each one carried only a few torpedoes, some twin 50 caliber machine guns, and the nerves of the men inside. Armor? None. If a Japanese shell struck the deck, the boat would erupt in flames faster than a man could take a breath. The crews joked grimly that they didn't need coffins. The sea would take care of that. In the daytime, they hid under camouflage nets near small jungle bases carved out of the coastlines, places like Rendova, New Georgia, and Vella La Vella. The sun would bake the paint off their decks and turn the air inside their cabins into a choking haze of sweat and diesel. But at night, the ocean became their world. They came alive when the rest of the fleet slept. Out there, in the darkness, they were hunters, silent, invisible, and armed with death. Their commander that night was Lieutenant Arthur Red Halloran, a 26-year-old from Boston who'd traded college textbooks for a wooden boat and a Thompson submachine gun. He leaned over the map table, tracing his finger along a narrow channel between Kolombangara and Arundel Island, the Blackett Strait. It was a treacherous stretch of water, flanked by jungle-covered ridges and laced with reefs. Halloran's orders were simple: intercept and disrupt a Japanese supply convoy expected to pass through before dawn. But simple didn't mean easy. The Japanese destroyers, the infamous Tokyo Express, had been running supplies at night for months, and their crews knew the strait better than anyone. Halloran glanced at his men. The engine mechanic, Doyle, sat shirtless, wiping oil from his hands with a rag that was already black. The torpedo man, Ensign Mallory, checked the firing circuits again and again, muttering to himself. The youngest, Petty Officer Blake, was staring into the darkness beyond the bow, listening to the water slap against the hull. They had done this before, but that didn't make it easier. The Japanese convoys came in fast, sometimes at over 30 knots, their decks blazing with gunfire if they suspected ambush. Against that, the PT boats had only one advantage: surprise. The men smoked quietly, watching the phosphorescent wake drift behind them like ghost light. Every flicker in the water could be a fish, or a sign of an enemy destroyer's searchlight cutting through the haze. "All hands quiet," Halloran whispered. "Engines low. We wait." There was something haunting about those waits. Hours would pass with no sound but the creak of the hull, the occasional cough from a nervous crewman. The jungle loomed on both sides, black, impenetrable, and alive with unseen things. Sometimes they heard the distant rumble of Japanese guns firing somewhere beyond the islands, the echo rolling over the sea like thunder from another world. Halloran reached into his pocket and touched the small photograph he always carried. His wife and their newborn daughter, taken just before he shipped out. He didn't know if the picture comforted him or made things worse. Every man on the boat had something like that. A face, a letter, a scrap of home folded inside their jacket. They never talked about it. But when the engines went silent, those ghosts came closer. Then, just before midnight, a faint sound came through the night. A distant mechanical hum, rhythmic, metallic. Every man froze. Halloran turned his binoculars toward the horizon, but the darkness swallowed everything. The hum grew louder. "Convoy," Doyle whispered. "Has to be." Halloran felt his heartbeat slow, not quicken. Adrenaline did strange things out here. The more danger came near, the calmer he became. He signaled the flotilla, a slow blink of a covered light. The other PT boats responded in kind, faint flashes barely visible against the night. 12 shadows shifted positions, spreading wide like wolves circling prey. He leaned close to Mallory. "Load tubes 1 and 2, set depth to 5 feet. We're going to give them a welcome." Mallory nodded, his hands steady even as sweat ran down his face. The crew moved with quiet precision. They had done this enough to know that hesitation meant death. Minutes passed. The hum became a roar. Then, faint pinpricks of light on the horizon. Halloran's stomach clenched. Japanese searchlights, sweeping slowly across the water. The convoy was close, maybe 2 miles. He could just make out the shape of a lead destroyer, sleek and dark, her bow slicing through the waves like a blade. The PT boat's engines rumbled as Halloran ordered half throttle. The hull began to vibrate underfoot. "Easy, easy," he whispered. "Keep her low." The boat moved forward, barely breaking the surface. Every sound magnified in the silence. When the first Japanese gun flashed in the distance, a warning shot fired at something unseen. Halloran's men instinctively ducked. The explosion lit up the horizon, a burst of orange against endless black. Then came another flash, and another. The Japanese were firing into the dark, unsure what was out there. Halloran smiled grimly. They had no idea the hunters were this close. He gave the signal. Mallory's fingers pressed the firing switch. The torpedoes slid free with a soft hiss and vanished into the black. A few seconds later, another followed. The crew held their breath. The seconds stretched like hours. And then, a distant explosion. A low, thunderous boom that rolled across the sea. Flames rose in the distance, red, then orange, then white. Someone laughed softly. A nervous, disbelieving sound. Halloran didn't. He was already turning the wheel hard, ordering full throttle. "Get us out," he said. "Before they find us." The PT boat leapt forward, engines screaming, spray flying over the bow. Behind them, chaos bloomed. Searchlights crisscrossed the night. Tracers stitched the water. And the Japanese destroyers began to return fire. Too late. And at ghosts already gone, for a few minutes, the ocean belonged to 12 wooden boats, and the men reckless enough to ride them. The Japanese called it the Tokyo Express. a lifeline of steel and salt water, feeding their war machine across the scattered islands of the South Pacific. On this night in late 1943, it was more than a supply run. It was a declaration of dominance. The Imperial Navy had built its reputation on precision and ferocity. Their destroyers were faster, their crews disciplined, and their gunners famously accurate. To them, the Solomons were not just territory. They were proof that Japan still ruled the Pacific's shadowed heart. The convoy moved through the Blackett Strait in a disciplined column, destroyers cutting through the black water like sharks, followed by transports carrying ammunition, food, and men bound for Bougainville. The sea was calm but heavy with heat, the air thick enough to taste. No moon rose to guide them, only the dull orange glow of distant volcanoes on the horizon. To the Japanese lookouts, the night felt safe. After all, who would dare attack a flotilla of destroyers? Captain Matsuda, commanding the lead destroyer Amagiri, stood on his bridge, his gloved hands resting on the rail. He had run this route a dozen times and felt the familiar blend of fatigue and control. His officers moved like clockwork, quiet, efficient, without wasted words. Below deck, the engines throbbed with mechanical rhythm, the heartbeat of a vessel bred for killing. Matsuda believed in order, in structure, in the unshakable superiority of Japanese naval doctrine. He could not imagine that, somewhere in the dark, fragile boats made of plywood waited to strike. But the Americans were there, small, silent, invisible. Lieutenant Halloran's flotilla had taken position along the strait's narrowest stretch, using the coastline itself as cover. Their engines were barely above idle, hulls drifting in sync with the current. Each man aboard those boats could hear his own heartbeat and the slow hiss of the sea against the bow. They had no radar worth trusting, no spotlights they dared use, and no armor to hide behind. Their only advantage was darkness. In those final minutes before contact, time felt unreal. Doyle's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the engine throttles, keeping the vibration low. Mallory wiped his hands on his pants again, though they were already dry. Blake whispered, "You think they'll even notice us?" Halloran didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was, if the Japanese noticed them, it would be too late, for one side or the other. Out across the water, faint shapes began to form, silhouettes barely visible against the horizon. Destroyers in motion, their wakes glowing faintly from the churn of phosphorescent plankton. The convoy stretched across the strait like a moving wall of death. The Japanese escorts kept tight formation, their guns trained outward, scanning for aircraft that would never come. They weren't looking down. They weren't looking for ghosts. Halloran raised his binoculars, the lenses catching a faint glimmer of light from a destroyer's bridge. He whispered, "That's them. Blackett Strait run. At least 5 destroyers. Maybe more." He could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that history had paused to watch what would happen next. He motioned to Mallory. "Spread formation. Get the other boats moving." The radio stayed silent. Too risky. Instead, a brief flicker of light flashed from boat to boat, barely visible unless you knew the code. One by one, the 12 PT boats fanned out, slipping into attack positions like wolves circling a herd. The Japanese convoy steamed on, oblivious. The Amagiri's gunnery officer leaned against the railing, smoking quietly, watching the reflection of the ship's wake trail behind them like molten silver. He thought about home, about Yokosuka, about the promise of victory. Somewhere beneath him, men loaded crates of ammunition, unaware that this would be their final voyage. Then, a flicker, a shadow on the surface of the water. Too small? Too fast? The lookout squinted, unsure if he'd seen it at all. "Captain," he called out softly, "movement on the port side." Matsuda frowned. "Searchlight." A beam of light swept the waves, slicing through the darkness like a blade. For an instant, It illuminated a glimmer of wood and spray, a shape barely the size of a fishing boat. Then gone. The searchlight swung again, finding nothing. Probably driftwood, an officer muttered. Matsuda said nothing. He didn't believe in luck, only vigilance. Keep the guns ready, he said coldly. Out in the dark, Halloran's crew froze as the searchlight passed over them. Every man held his breath. The beam missed by meters. The sound of the destroyer's engines thundered nearby, close enough that they could feel the vibrations through their deck. Doyle mouthed, "Jesus." Halloran's hands were steady. He whispered, "Hold." "Not yet." His mind calculated distances like instinct. One wrong move, and the convoy would open fire, and the PT boats would vanish in a wall of flame. The Japanese destroyers pressed on, the rumble of their screws churning the sea into froth. A faint metallic clang echoed through the night as one of the transports shifted cargo. Matsuda exhaled, satisfied. All clear. He turned his gaze forward, unaware that he had just passed through the jaws of an invisible trap. Halloran watched, waited, then whispered, "Now." Mallory fired the first torpedo. The hiss of compressed air broke the stillness, followed by the faint splash as the weapon cut into the sea, streaking toward the lead ship. Another boat fired, then another. 12 wooden vessels unleashed their steel fury at once, torpedoes fanning out like arrows in the dark. Seconds passed. Nothing. Then, a roar. The first torpedo struck one of the transport's midsection, igniting fuel and ammunition in a single deafening blast. Fire erupted into the sky, turning night into day. The convoy's formation broke instantly. Alarms screamed, searchlights flared to life, and tracer rounds tore through the air in blinding arcs. The Japanese admirals would later call it impossible, a phantom attack. But on that night, 12 wooden boats had cracked open the illusion of Japanese naval invincibility, and the battle had only just begun. The sea was on fire. Where moments ago there had been only silence and darkness, now the night blazed with orange and white fury. Columns of flame climbed hundreds of feet into the air as burning fuel slicked the waves. The Japanese convoy, once a machine of perfect precision, had erupted into chaos. Destroyers swerved wildly, cutting through their own formation, their searchlights sweeping frantically across the strait in all directions. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and burning flesh. Halloran's PT boat dove into the smoke. "Engines full ahead," he shouted, gripping the wheel with both hands. The craft leapt forward, the twin Packard engines roaring like beasts. Spray crashed over the bow, drenching the men. Doyle's hands flew across the throttles, keeping the engines balanced as tracer fire streaked past. Green and red arcs cutting the night apart. "They're blind," Mallory yelled over the roar. "Keep weaving!" They were blind, but so were the Americans. The smoke was thick enough to taste, and the searchlights from the Japanese destroyers turned everything into a disorienting blur. For every second they stayed close, the risk grew. A single hit from those 5-inch guns and the boat would be splinters. But Halloran didn't back off. He had seen the first torpedo hit home. He had felt the shockwave rattle through his bones. They'd drawn blood, and that meant one thing. The myth of Japanese invincibility was cracking. Behind him, the other PT boats moved like phantoms, barely visible, their wakes glowing faintly under the burning sky. One broke formation and darted left, trying to flank the lead destroyer. Another cut engines entirely, drifting in silence as Japanese gunners poured shells into empty sea. To the enemy, it must have felt like being attacked by ghosts, small, swift, and everywhere at once. "Enemy bearing starboard," Mallory shouted. Halloran looked and saw it. The shadow of a destroyer emerging through the haze, its guns flashing. The rounds screamed overhead, slamming into the water behind them with geysers of spray. "Hold her steady," Halloran barked. "Range 700. Get ready to fire." The PT boat surged forward, the engines howling. Halloran's world narrowed to a single line. The enemy's bow. He watched for the split second when their searchlight swept away, then slammed his hand down. "Fire!" the torpedo hissed out, vanishing beneath the waves. Halloran veered sharply to port, throttles wide open. The sea exploded again, this time much closer. A fountain of water and steel erupted from the destroyer's side. The massive ship lurched, engines grinding, fire bursting from its midsection. For a moment, even the Japanese searchlights went still. The noise, the chaos, it all seemed to pause. Then the destroyer began to list, bow dipping as crewmen scrambled across the deck. Halloran stared in disbelief. They'd done it again! Hit confirmed! Mallory yelled, his voice raw with adrenaline. Blake was laughing, hysterical, tears streaming down his soot-streaked face. Doyle slammed a fist against the engine casing. That's for every man they shelled at Tulagi. But the celebration lasted only seconds. The other destroyers had turned their guns. A rain of tracers and high-explosive shells tore through the darkness. The sea itself seemed to erupt, geysers of fire and steel rising all around. One of the PT boats took a direct hit, vanishing in an instant. No wreckage, no survivors. Just a brief flare of orange on the black horizon. Halloran didn't look back. "Zigzag pattern!" he shouted. "Stay unpredictable." The PT boat danced across the waves, engines shrieking in protest as they changed direction every few seconds. The smell of burning paint and salt water filled the air. Pieces of shrapnel clanged off the deck, one slicing past Halloran's shoulder. He barely noticed. Through the smoke and fire, the night began to shift. The convoy's neat columns had disintegrated into chaos. Japanese destroyers collided, transports ran aground, and men leapt into the sea. The PT boats, outnumbered and outgunned, vanished into the confusion. Firing torpedoes, disappearing again before the enemy could retaliate. It wasn't just bravery. It was madness with purpose. They weren't trying to sink every ship. They were trying to unmake the enemy's confidence. On the bridge of the Amagiri, Captain Matsuda was shouting orders that no one could follow. His ears rang from the explosions, his mouth filled with smoke. "Find them! Find the enemy boats!" he roared. But the truth was brutal. His destroyers were too large, too slow. They were built to fight cruisers and submarines, not wooden ghosts that could vanish in seconds. Every radar sweep came back empty. Every gunner fired blind. Halloran's PT boat circled wide, coming up behind the formation. From here, he could see the carnage, the burning transports, the crippled destroyer still trying to turn, the oil slicks spreading across the surface like a living thing. The flames reflected off the waves in long streaks of gold and crimson. The ocean looked alive, writhing in agony. He could hear Blake whisper under his breath, "We did this." There was awe in his voice, and fear. Halloran said nothing. He knew what came next. Retaliation. The Japanese would never let this go unanswered. The radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static. "This is PT-164, taking fire near Kolombangara. Engines hit! We're sinking!" Halloran grabbed the receiver, shouting back, but the line went dead. Somewhere out there, another boat, another set of faces he knew, had disappeared beneath the waves. He stared into the firelit sea and felt something shift inside him. The thrill of survival curdled into a deeper dread. They had proven a point tonight, but at what cost? How many more nights like this could men endure before the ocean swallowed them all? Behind him, the engines roared as Doyle pushed them harder, the PT boat slicing through smoke and embers toward open water. Around them, the sky glowed faintly with the reflection of fire on low clouds. The battle was fading, but the echoes remained. Distant explosions, screams carried by wind, and the slow hiss of burning ships sinking into the black. Halloran glanced at the compass, steadying his voice. "We're pulling back," he said. "But they'll remember this night." And he was right. In Tokyo, the reports would read like madness. 12 American patrol boats, barely armored, had torn through a convoy guarded by destroyers. To the Imperial Navy, it was not just a loss of ships, it was a wound to pride, one that would fester long after the fires went out. But for Halloran and his men, the night was not victory. It was survival, fragile, fleeting, and uncertain. As dawn began to edge over the horizon, the silhouettes of the other PT boats reappeared one by one, limping home through smoke and silence. The battle was over. The ghosts had done their work. Dawn came slowly over the Solomons, a gray, reluctant light that revealed the devastation left behind. The Blackett Strait was no longer water. It was a graveyard. Smoke curled from burning hulls, drifting low across the surface like a funeral shroud. Pieces of wreckage, planks, helmets, oil drums, bodies, floated in silence. The Pacific had swallowed the night's violence, leaving only its aftermath. From the bridge of the Amagiri, Captain Matsuda watched the sun rise through a haze of smoke and flame. The lead transport was gone, split in two by a torpedo strike. Another destroyer, Hagekaze, listed sharply to port, its stern gone, its crew abandoning ship in small rafts. Matsuda gripped the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had been trained to face death, but not humiliation. To him, this was worse than defeat. This was desecration. "Sir," his first officer said softly, "the enemy boats, they vanished." Matsuda's jaw tightened. "Vanished," he repeated. "Into thin air?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. He turned his gaze back to the water, scanning the horizon. The enemy was gone, yes, but the ocean still felt haunted. Far to the south, beyond the reach of Japanese guns, Lieutenant Halloran's surviving PT boats regrouped near Rendova. The crews were exhausted, faces streaked with soot and salt, eyes hollow with disbelief. They'd pulled 2 men from the water, survivors from PT 164, burned and half-conscious. The medics worked silently on deck, their bandages turning crimson almost instantly. Doyle, his shirt torn and hands still slick with engine oil, sat on the deck beside them, staring at the sky. "We're alive," he murmured. "Somehow, we're still alive." Halloran stood at the bow, watching the smoke rise from the direction of the strait. In the daylight, it looked unreal, like some distant storm on the horizon. He tried to count how many ships had burned, but the numbers blurred together. It didn't matter. The mission had been to stop the convoy. They'd done that. But victory, in the Pacific, never felt like triumph. It always felt like survival delayed. By midday, the sea began to glitter again, blue and endless, as if trying to erase the memory of what had happened. The PT boats drifted near a small inlet, refueling from spare drums and patching the bullet holes in their hulls. Men worked in silence. Every hammer strike sounded too loud, too final. The laughter and relief that had erupted after their escape was gone now. What remained was a heavy quiet, the kind that only comes when men realize what they've done, and what it's cost. Halloran wiped sweat from his brow and leaned against the rail. He thought of the men they'd lost, of PT 164, of the faces that would never see home again. In his pocket, the photograph of his wife and daughter was still there, its edges singed from the night's heat. He unfolded it carefully, staring at the smiling faces frozen in time. "You'd hate this place," he whispered. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. "Base to PT flotilla," came a distant voice. "Japanese air reconnaissance spotted over Vela Gulf. Likely retaliation strike. Return to base. Repeat, return to base." Doyle cursed under his breath. "They're coming for us," Halloran gave a small nod. "Of course they are." He turned toward the other boats, raising a hand. "Engines on. We're not staying to give them a target." The men moved fast, trained by repetition and fear alike. Within minutes, the flotilla was moving, low, fast, cutting through the waves toward the safety of Rendova. Behind them, the Japanese began their revenge. From the airfields at Rabaul, squadrons of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers roared to life. Within an hour, the sky over the Solomon Sea filled with engines. To the Japanese command, this was not a counterattack. It was vengeance. They believed the Americans' victory had been luck, an insult that needed to be erased. The first planes appeared just after noon, black dots against the blinding sky. The PT boats were small targets, almost invisible against the water, but the Japanese weren't aiming precisely. They were punishing. Bombs fell in clusters, sending columns of spray and fire skyward. The sea became a mirror of the night before, churning, violent, alive with smoke and death. Halloran's crew weaved between the plumes, the engines screaming. Doyle shouted readings over the roar. "Speed 35 knots! Port engine overheating!" Halloran gritted his teeth. "Keep her moving!" The PT boat darted through explosions, spray crashing over the deck. One bomb fell so close that it lifted the stern out of the water, slamming it back down hard enough to crack the hull. Mallory grabbed his shoulder, shouting over the chaos. "We can't outrun them forever!" "We don't need forever," Halloran replied. "Just enough." They veered into a narrow channel between two jungle-covered islands, the engines echoing against the cliffs. The bombers overshot, dropping payloads into the open sea beyond. The sky thundered, the ocean rose, and then quiet again. The sound of the engines faded to a low growl. The air smelled of burned fuel and wet vegetation. Halloran's hands trembled as he steadied the wheel. The adrenaline drained from his veins, leaving only exhaustion. "Report!" he called hoarsely. Doyle glanced at the gauges, then up at him. "She'll hold," he said. Barely. The crew sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of retreating engines. The jungle seemed to breathe around them, a vast, indifferent presence. Mallory leaned against the gun mount, eyes unfocused. "You think they'll ever stop coming?" he asked. Halloran didn't answer right away. He stared out at the sunlight breaking through the smoke, glittering off the waves. "No," he said finally, "but neither will we." That night, as the PT boats limped back toward their base, the sea reflected the glow of the fires still burning over the horizon. The water shimmered gold and red, as if the Pacific itself had caught fire and refused to go out. In Tokyo, admirals studied the reports with disbelief. 12 American boats, made of wood and tin, had shattered their convoy. They would call it an anomaly, a fluke of luck and circumstance. But among the sailors who survived, a new superstition took root. Whispers of invisible hunters that haunted the straits after dark. They began to call them the shadows on the water. And for the men of the PT flotilla, the name felt fitting. They weren't heroes. They weren't even soldiers anymore. They were ghosts, alive for one more night, bound to the endless burning sea. The Pacific remembers everything. Every scream swallowed by its depths, every wreck that sank beneath its waves, every light that flickered out beneath the rising sun. For the men who fought upon it, the sea was both ally and enemy, a shifting, endless graveyard that gave no mercy and asked for none. By the winter of 1943, word of the Blackett Strait raid had spread like wildfire through the Allied bases in the Solomons. Newspapers would never print the full story. The details were buried under censor's ink, but among the men it became legend. They said 12 PT boats had taken on the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and lived to tell the tale. They said those boats, built of plywood and spit, had made destroyers burn. But for Lieutenant Halloran, there was nothing glorious in the telling. Only memory, raw, heavy, unshakable. The surviving flotilla had limped back to Rendova under gray skies. The base was a patchwork of mud and palm trunks, the air always thick with the smell of fuel and salt. Mechanics swarmed over the battered boats, patching holes with resin and prayer. Men slept where they sat, their faces smeared with oil and ash. Every time Halloran closed his eyes, he saw the fire. The Japanese ships twisting and burning in the night, the water glowing like molten glass. He heard the screams. He felt the vibration of the torpedo detonations in his bones. Victory had never felt so much like guilt. He stood alone on the dock, cigarette in hand, staring at the wreckage-strewn horizon. Behind him, voices echoed faintly. Doyle arguing with a mechanic over engine timing. Mallory laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. Blake sitting cross-legged by the gun mount, cleaning it for the 10th time that morning. It was how they coped. They worked, they joked, they pretended the ocean hadn't tried to swallow them whole. A runner approached, a young Navy messenger with a clipboard and dust on his boots. "Lieutenant Halloran?" Halloran turned. "That's me. Command wants your report by 1800 hours. They're calling it a success." Halloran stared at the kid for a moment, then nodded. "Tell them it depends on how you define success." The boy hesitated, unsure whether it was sarcasm, then saluted and left. Halloran crushed his cigarette underfoot and looked back at the sea. The sun was already starting to drop, turning the waves the color of old brass. For a moment, he thought he saw something move out there. A flicker, a reflection, as if the ghosts of the night before still lingered beneath the surface. He told himself it was just the light. That evening, when the heat began to fade and the first stars appeared, he finally sat down to write his report. The small operations hut was lit by a single bare bulb, the air humming with insects. His handwriting was steady, but his words came slow. Enemy convoy engaged. Approximate losses. 1 transport, 1 destroyer, multiple damaged. U.S. losses. 2 boats, confirmed sunk. 14 men missing, presumed dead. He paused there for a long time, pen hovering over the page. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Enemy formation displayed confusion and breakdown of discipline following torpedo strikes. Engagement lasted approximately 27 minutes. 27 minutes, less than half an hour, and yet it felt like a lifetime burned into his mind." Outside, the jungle was alive with the sound of cicadas and the faint crash of waves. Doyle appeared in the doorway, a shadow against the lamplight. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked quietly. Halloran didn't look up. "Next?" Doyle stepped inside. "We hit them hard, sure, but they'll hit back. You know that, right? They don't let things go." Halloran smiled faintly, a tired, bitter smile. "Yeah, I know." He set the pen down and rubbed his eyes. "The thing is, Doyle, they think they can scare us with bigger ships, bigger guns. But out there, in the dark, all that matters is who sees first. Who fires first? Who's willing to take the risk?" Doyle nodded slowly. "Guess that makes us the ghosts then." "Maybe," Halloran said. "Or maybe just men pretending not to be afraid." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of the sea through the open door. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled. Or maybe it was artillery. In this part of the world, the two often sounded the same. By midnight, the base was quiet again. Most of the men were asleep, sprawled across cots and crates. The only sounds were the low hum of generators and the whisper of waves against the pier. Halloran stood once more on the dock, watching the horizon. The fires from the previous night had finally died, but faint smoke still lingered, hanging low over the distant islands. It looked like the ghosts refused to leave. He thought of the Japanese sailors, men not so different from himself, trained, disciplined, proud. They had died in the same ocean, under the same indifferent sky. War didn't care about uniforms or languages. It only cared about fuel, steel, and time. Mallory joined him quietly, holding 2 tin cups. "Coffee," he said, handing one over. Halloran took it, nodding his thanks. They drank in silence, the bitter taste grounding them both. "You know," Mallory said finally, "I used to think the ocean was peaceful. Now I can't hear waves without hearing engines underneath." Halloran glanced at him. "That's how it starts. You never really hear silence again." Mallory looked out at the dark water. "Do you think people back home will ever understand what this is like?" Halloran shook his head. "No. And that's probably for the best." For a while, they just stood there, two silhouettes against the vast, uncaring sea. The stars shimmered faintly above, reflected in the rippling black water below. When the next morning came, new orders awaited them. Another convoy had been spotted moving through the slot. The Japanese were regrouping, adjusting their tactics. Halloran folded the orders and tucked them into his jacket. The men were already prepping the boats, their movements automatic. There was no talk of fear, no mention of rest, just the rhythm of routine, the only thing keeping them sane. As they pushed off the dock, Doyle called out, "What do we call this one, Lieutenant?" Halloran smiled faintly, gripping the wheel. Same as before, another night, another chance to vanish. The engines roared to life, echoing across the bay. The boats slipped into formation, gliding out toward the open sea. The water stretched before them, endless, unknowable. Behind them, the island faded into mist. Ahead lay darkness. The men of the PT flotilla would go on to fight again and again across the Pacific, in the Solomons, the Philippines, and beyond. Many would never return, but those who did would carry the memory of nights like this, of roaring engines, burning seas, and the knowledge that sometimes courage wasn't about glory. It was about enduring the fear long enough to do what had to be done. And in the decades to come, fishermen and sailors passing through the Blackett Strait would tell stories of lights that moved beneath the surface, of faint engine hums on windless nights, of shadows that drifted just beyond the reach of searchlights. They said the ghosts of the PT boats still haunted those waters, forever hunting, forever fleeing. 12 shadows on the water, bound to the sea that had both cursed and saved them. Because in war, legends are born from fire, but ghosts are made from those who survive it.